Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Newman, Vice President of the Family Freedom Project. I'm just leaving the courthouse here in Fort Bend County. This is the end of day 2 of the hearing in the Henderson case, where we're trying to get Ivy and Nico sent home to their family. And I'll give you the quick updates first. The hearing went really well. The judge has not released her order yet. That's pretty common in these cases where you don't usually get an order right there on the bench after a big contested hearing like this. And so we would expect in the coming days, possibly next week, to get an email from the judge explaining what her order is. I would say we're very hopeful. I'm trying to summarize 2 days of testimony here, but let me see if I can give you guys some of the high points. What came out in closing arguments is really telling. And one of the first most important things is the case, or the attorney for Ivy, who's appointed by the state to represent her, that's a common procedure in these cases, basically retreated. Normally, the attorney for Ivy, for the child in these cases, is just in lockstep with CPS all the time. They're like a second attorney for CPS, do everything that CPS does. Well, here, in closing arguments, she basically said, "Judge, I don't know what to do. I'm glad this is your decision, not mine." And she just acknowledged straight up that the hospital system totally failed these parents and didn't do the right tests. And then in CPS's closing argument, they too tried to distance themselves from the hospital and implied, if not outright stated, that the hospital's failures were not their own and shouldn't be held against them, which of course just ignores the reality that they're basing their removal on what the hospital did. But nonetheless, that was CPS's position. And so then, to try and summarize some of the testimony for you guys, one of the most kind of important things that just gets really glossed over in these cases I wanted to bring out was actually brought up by one of the final expert in the case, where he said one of the oddities about having this type of debate in the child abuse context at all is that the fractures that we're talking about that were found on Ivy's scan, first of all, it's hotly contested in the medical community whether these are really fractures at all or whether they're caused by something totally benign. But second of all, they're definitely not what anyone thinks of as a fracture. First of all, there's not like a displaced break in the bone or something like that. There's no pain, there's no discomfort. You would never know that there was anything odd about the bones at all, but for the fact that you did a scan and could see it internally, right? So it's not as if the child is in pain or was harmed in any way. We're just treating this thing as if it's a harm to the child because it falls under this fracture label. And his point was, it's strange that we're having this debate where we talk about this as if it's a question of whether it was child abuse or not, even though everybody agrees the child wasn't harmed, like in the sense of having pain or it's not like there was bruising or anything like that. It's a totally internal thing that doesn't cause pain, doesn't cause discomfort. There's no loss of function. The child would never know. You would never know from handling the child. And yet we're having this debate about whether it rises to some level of child abuse. So that was an interesting kind of characterization that he made there at the end that I thought was a really good point. But to kind of summarize the rest of the testimony for you guys, all of the experts agreed that the Texas Children's Hospital just totally failed in their task of investigating what happened, and that instead they seemed to have just assumed from the beginning that abuse had taken place, and everything that occurred after that was just confirmation bias because that's all they were looking for. And that there were numerous other medical explanations that could have and should have been investigated. None of them were, and that most of them now can't be because they weren't checked for at the time, which is the only time they could have been evaluated. And CPS just straight up seems to acknowledge that that's the case, but yet they still want Ivy and they still want Nico. And their fallback position repeatedly was, they said, when all of these experts came up, their fallback repeatedly was, they asked them, but is it possible that it could have been caused by abuse? Which of course the answer is almost always yes, anything's possible. And that to them is enough. Like the fact that, well, it's possible, right? Nobody can definitively say that it was or wasn't this thing. And it just gives you some insight into their thinking that they've totally flipped the burden on these parents, where instead of the state having to prove that This thing, which could have been caused by 100 different causes, was caused by child abuse, so we're taking your child. That's not what they're doing. That's not even what they're arguing. Instead, what they're arguing is this thing, which could have been caused by 100 different causes, one of those causes happens to be child abuse. And because you can't take that cause off the list of possible causes, we're taking your children. Which of course applies to almost any type of injury that a child ever presented with at a children's hospital. And that's besides the fact that nobody is arguing that the fractures that Ivy had were painful, or that the bones were really even damaged per se. Like, there's no loss of function. And it's something you would never even know but for the fact that you conducted this scan. And then the mark on Ivy's face, one of the things that came out is that essentially the same mark appeared to show back up months later in a less severe fashion, but the hospital never checked for it at the time to evaluate what it actually was. They just assumed it was a burn. And there was no scarring left over from it, as you would normally expect from a burn. And so in the end, even CPS and the attorney for Ivy just retreated essentially from any defense of the hospital. And even the hospital's own expert, right, the child abuse pediatrician who originally did the analysis that concluded that this was probably caused by abuse, she got on the stand and was excluded from being allowed to testify as an expert, which means she can recount what happened when she was at the hospital, but she's not allowed to give any type of expert opinion on it because she's not actually even certified as a child abuse pediatrician. She's still in training. And so she was excluded early on from that. And this is one of the other just, I don't know, obnoxious, shocking types of things that they just kind of say out loud without thinking about it, is that the state repeatedly made this argument that they said, we're not accusing the parents of harming their child. And there was actually an audible gasp in the courtroom when they said this, because, and somebody even said, like, why are we here if you're not accusing these parents? And the state's response was, they're not able to explain what happened. So, and of course, the hospital's doctors weren't able to explain it either. And so the situation that we're in now is the state is literally saying, we're not accusing you of doing anything, but there's this medical problem that the doctors can't explain and that you can't explain. Oh, and because you can't explain it, we're going to take your child and keep them for now a year and not give them back. And this is kind of leads into the next point. The caseworker on the stand just insisted that one of the reasons that they couldn't return the children to the Hendersons is because they wouldn't take responsibility. Now, they'll tell you that doesn't mean admit guilt. But then when you try and pin them on, well, what does it mean? Literally, the only way that you can win in these cases in the eyes of CPS is if you come in and admit guilt. But then, of course, if you do admit guilt, why would they send your child back? So it's this catch-22, and this came out really clearly, I think, in front of the judge, that they're arguing the parents haven't taken responsibility, but to them that means you have to tell us that you did it. But then, of course, if you tell them that, then you lose too. So there's just not a world where they're willing to send the child back. And at the end of the hearing, I would say it was really abundantly clear that the state's only argument was, despite all of the missteps from the hospital and from CPS in this case, we can't rule out that it's possible that maybe some type of abuse did occur. And they believe that's enough. They actually believe that's enough to take someone's child from them indefinitely. And they said at the hearing, their goal at this point is termination of parental rights, permanent termination of parental rights. So that's where we are. And I think overall the hearing went really well. The testimony, I think, was just indisputable on behalf of the parents. And the ruling now that we're waiting for could come in the next couple of days, might happen next week. And I'm pretty optimistic about that. And of course, even if we didn't get the ruling that we need there, then we're fighting it on appeal or in the next hearing, one way or the other, that Ivy and Nico will be coming home. So thank you guys for following. We'll give you more updates as things progress.